So I'm not going to introduce the panel. Their bios are in the program. But I just want to say how privileged we are to have this group of elected officials and advocates and government leaders here at John Jay discussing sentencing reform. It was an easy call to all of them. They said they wanted to be here, which was terrific. And the inspired idea that came to me in a moment of clarity that comes every once in a while was to ask my colleague, who's the dean of the CUNY Law School, Michelle Anderson, to be our MC. So she's a great scholar. CUNY Law School, I'll make a plug for her because she can't. CUNY Law School has been this rocket of improving excellence and winning all sorts of awards for being best public interest law school in the country and that sort of thing. And that is a tribute to Michelle, her leadership and her faculty. Okay, and I've just introduced Michelle. So are we done? We done the pictures? Yeah. Okay, well done. So, mic is yours.
Can everyone hear me? Great. I want to welcome you back from the coffee break and say that, like Jeremy, I'm not going to introduce the members of the panel except by way of the questions that I ask them, because there are so many of them and they are so interesting, and I'd rather get to their work and their thoughts. I'm going to begin actually by framing the work of the National Academy of Sciences report and looking specifically here at New York. This panel is about the implications of that report for the state of New York. And so we're going to start with what it looks like here in New York and how New York compares with some of the national trends. And I want to turn to Professor Shawn Bushway first. Can you take us through some of the similarities and differences? We have a fact sheet in the materials that you've been handed that lists that have some data about New York specifically, as well as the national picture. And I wanted to turn to you, Professor Bushway, to take us through some of that information.
Sure. I think the biggest thing that you can see in the state of New York versus the larger United States picture is that while the ramp up in incarceration occurred in a similar way, starting in around in the 1998 or so, there's been a rather dramatic, perhaps not as dramatic as we'd like, but dramatic nonetheless, 25% decline in the incarceration rate. And so that's a big part of the story for what's going on in the state, that this has been sustained during a period in which crime is also declining. And this is very unusual. This is leading to have a big state like New York have such a large decline in the incarceration rate at the same time crime is dropping is unusual and an important story. But it's important to note, and I think this was work done by Vera, that a lot of that story has happened largely in New York City. And it's not as part of the story that's happened statewide. It's primarily a New York City story. And so I think that's a frame for how we think about the problem. And maybe there are some lessons, because one of the things that when you read the report, at least when I read the report, that I find very interesting is that this is only the tip of the iceberg. They focused on the tip, and I think that's an important tip of the iceberg, but there's a danger when you only focus on the tip that you miss the larger story. And when I say it's the tip of the iceberg, I think if you look at figure 2.4 on page 41 of the report, what you show is that while there's while incarceration has increased 4 times during this period that we're talking about, so has probation, so has jail, and so has conviction rates. And so what you have is an experience of dramatic net widening during this time period. So it's not a story. What we've done is we took a bunch of people that used to be on probation and we sentenced them to prison. What we did was, given that you're convicted, your probability of going to prison in 1975 is almost exactly the same as it is now. What we've done is we've convicted a lot more people. And so in some of the work I've done, you can show that, for example, 30% of people in the United States have at least one arrest by age 23. And that number for convictions is like 20%. And that's a dramatic increase over what the situation was, say, in 1970. So what we have is experienced a dramatic net widening. And so when you're thinking about solutions, a solution where you only think about decreasing who goes to prison and not thinking about what happens to everyone else in terms of probation or jail or other alternative sentencing is probably not the right solution. And in terms of New York, if you look at what's going on in New York, at the same time that the prison population is declining, guess what? So is jail, so is probation. They move together. And so if you think about that in the context of policy changes that happen in the state of New York, I think you have to be sensitive to an awareness of not just what happens to a policy change and its impact on sentence or sentence length, but also what it does in terms of changing the conviction probabilities or the probability that people are going to go to probation. In the Sentencing Commission over the last 2 years, I guess, we've been focused on determinate sentencing. As many of you know, in New York, starting in 1994, I believe, we went from an indeterminate to a determinate system for violent offending, and then after that, we moved that to indeterminate to determinate for drug sentencing, and we're now considering doing the same thing for non-drug and non-violent crimes. The reason to motivate this is because the sentencing is clearer under determinate sentencing. It makes more sense to people. However, there's a risk that when you have these kinds of determinate sentencing available, that you increase the leverage available to prosecutors, not only to send people to prison, but to induce convictions in the first place. And we've been very sensitive. When the other moves went, they just took the upper limits from indeterminate sentence and moved those over to the same limits in determinate sentencing. But we've been very conscious during this discussion not to do that and to really think about what are the implications of what the upper limits would be in a determinate sentencing regime. Both because we're worried about the increased sentence lengths or sending more people to prison, but also because we're conscious of the fact that we may fundamentally change the leverage that prosecutors have to induce plea bargains.
So, Professor Bushway, can you tell us a little bit about, from your perspective, what, and the commission you're referencing is Jonathan Littman, the Chief Judge of New York State, established a New York State Permanent Commission on Sentencing. Mr. Cyrus Vance is the chair of that commission, and we have Judge Bing Newton and yourself who are members of that commission. Can you tell us what you think from your perspective on that commission, and otherwise as a scholar, what you think New York State has done right, and where there is further area where we need substantial reform?
I think that there's an attempt, more so than at least another. What I think having the commission in the first place is doing something right? Having a permanent sentencing commission where you actually talk about these things and think about formally about what the sentencing policy should be about is a step in the right direction, right? If you just, and so I think that's, I think there were two previous. The judge, she always talks about how many sentencing commissions she's been on, and it's more than two. But this one's permanent, and I think it provides a framework for actually talking about the policy. And I think one of the things that happened here that at least I feel has been very important is there's been a real attempt to base the discussion not just on personal opinion, but on evidence. And on, not evidence based in what you're talking about in terms of causal links and things, but just if we're going to say we think this is going to happen, we have some reason, we have some evidence, some data that we've gotten, that we've looked at, that we've discussed. So that there's been a real, I think, change in the tenor of the conversation at some level. Not to say politics aren't important, but or that other things are going to come into play, but we've been trying very hard to base that. And I think that's something that's been done correctly. And I think the fact that there's lots of different players at the table, and that the conversation's been very broad, I think has been a real contribution and a real positive step forward. The other thing is that when you look, this happens a lot, I can tell you on the national level, when you think about what's going on in New York, when you talk about prison policies such as visiting or other things like that, New York is invariably a leader. New York's one of the only states that has a policy against discrimination against ex-offenders that's part of the state statute. New York is one of the leaders in the degree to which visiting is allowed. I mean, there's lots of places where New York's actually quite in the forefront of progressive policies. And what I think has to be happening perhaps more concretely is evidence to show that it's working, maybe taking that next step to do the research to demonstrate the value of these kinds of policies, because the policies actually exist. And I think that's a step that's starting to potentially happen in a way that I think in the past And I think DCJS and DOCS and the Office of the Governor really deserves a lot of credit for trying to take that next step, not just to have good data systems, not just to have good progressive policies, but to also then do the research that documents the benefits of these things.
So I want to turn to another member of this permanent commission, Judge Juanita Bing Newton. And you do joke about having been on 3 different sentencing commissions, and I want to ask you about the trajectory that you've taken on in this work, and also your sense of how some of the reforms that we've tried to engage in have led to some of the problems that we're grappling with now.
So this is a very sobering morning for me because we talked about the dramatic changes in the book over 40 years, and I've been associated with the criminal justice system for the last 39. And so I think that people like me take responsibility for some of what is in existence today. I think the best thing about this current sentencing commission that I'm on is that it is a sentencing commission that has only one goal, and that is to improve sentencing. And Cyrus tells us that, you know, we are to take on challenges that will improve the process. So we take only, whereas the other 2 sentencing commissions I were on were governors' committee that had very, very specific targeted goals. The first one was a charge to convert indeterminate into determinate. So it was, we wanted a bill, and it was very specific. And there the goal was more to collapse what was into what is, that is a determinate sentencing. The consequence of that, of course, was to raise sentences because the numbers in the box ended up being more important than I think than most other policies, notwithstanding some of the very interesting discussions we had. So when I started as a prosecutor in 1975, a B felony robbery defendant could get an old zip sentence. Anybody else older than I am that knows what a zip sentence is? You could get a 0 to 3. Today, a person convicted of robbery in the first degree is looking at 6, 7, 8, 9 years. So that's the first thing that has happened. We've made, policy means choices. We've made choices to put bigger numbers in the box, whether it's an indeterminate system or a determinate system. We've had bigger numbers in the box. The second sentencing commission I was on was under Governor Patterson, and I think they had a goal too, and that's what can we do with Rockefeller drug laws. And one of the reasons we have fewer people in jail for less time is because there has been this reform with a focus on treatment. And that's another example of what numbers you put in the box matters. So I got into a little bit of trouble back in the 90s when I declined to sentence a 17-year-old girl to 15 to life after conviction and trial. The world did not end that she did not get 15 to life. It felt like it might have ended, but it didn't, and this is the dilemma for judges, because sentencing is hard, and if it's not hard, we're not doing it the right way. So someone said judges need to be responsible. I think judges do need to take some responsibility for what has happened over the 40 years, probably for being not vocal enough about the importance of discretion. But this young lady, 12 judges heard this case. It went all the way up to the highest court. So if I have the temerity to include myself with appellate judges, there was me, 5 judges on the appellate division, and 6 judges on the Court of Appeals, and 12 judges heard this case, and we split 6 to 6 on how this case should be handled. That's because the issues are complex, and that's because some of us looked more towards the principles that this book talks about, parsimony, proportionality, and in the proportionality, I asked Dean Travis, President Travis, what did that mean? Because I was disturbed that the proportionality piece did not specifically mention, it mentioned the seriousness of the crime, but it did not specifically mention the offender. So I think a good judge, when sentencing, looks at the crime, but has to look at the offender, and he told me that's okay. The looking at the offender is a subset, so we're going to take it from the subset to the primary. But I think that it's a difficult issue. The problem is that we've had this, I'm going to be like most judges, an advocate for an opportunity to have discretion. But when we are working within a certain box with numbers, then our discretion is limited. We are also limited by plea bargaining. We have in New York sentence bargaining, once again, so what the sentences, numbers in the box will determine who goes to jail. The reality is that I think that as a policy, we need to ask the question about sentencing is, why are we here? what's the purpose we're to achieve? You know, I'm so old school that, they taught me in college, it was deterrent, it was, I should ask Marty Horn to tell me again, it's deterrence and incapacitation, that was my favorite one. Rehabilitation and retribution, right? And so where are we now? We are, I think, decidedly in a retributive state. We don't even give money for programs except very special programs in jail. So the bottom line is, I think that these sentencing commissions, especially the current one, gives us an opportunity to take a step back, to rethink what the numbers are, to ask the question, can we still have public safeties, and reemphasize those 4 principles of sentencing, which look very much like the 4 principles, but this has been gussied up a little bit, and more 21st century, more smarter, and talking about the outcomes for people going into prison should not be debilitating to them or to the communities that they return to. But judges have to be on the forefront for trying to do things like that. It's easy for us to ratchet up the numbers. Bail is another example of that. I mean, I look at the bails that are set these days and I say, wow, who's supposed to make that kind of bail? You know, a robbery now is, in the old days, it was $5,000 bail. Now it's $50,000 or $100,000 or $1 million. You know, pick a number out of the sky. As some people say, any bail the defendant make is you set the bail too low, right? And that's an unfortunate policy choice that people are making.
So, you know, obviously one of the criticisms of indeterminate sentencing or maximizing judicial discretion is that it leads to some of the disparities we've seen. But you're a judge, and you are committed to maximizing discretion. Tell me how you make sense of those things in your mind.
You don't think there's a disparity now? I mean, the determinate sentencing hasn't changed the problem with disparity. The disparity comes in from day one. Who gets arrested and who doesn't get arrested? Who gets charged, who doesn't get charged? What do you think about this person? I find it interesting. I think Mr. Khalil talked about community challenges. I remember when heroin was introduced into my South Bronx project neighborhood in the 60s. And the response was what? Jail, jail, more jail. We all remember the crack epidemic. And we now know what was the response. Even more jail with more collateral consequences, which are the 2 words. It's like plastics. It's the 2 words that really probably have more problems with our criminal justice system than anything else. Today, we have a governor of a state say that the biggest problem of the state was heroin addiction. And this was Vermont or New Hampshire, one of those places north of here, right? But there was not a call for jail and more jail. There was a call for medical intervention. There was a call for jobs. There was a policy call for corrective societal issues. So what was the difference between 1968, 1975, 1984, except now that we see the color of individuals, and this is a disparity issue, you know, how we think about who comes before us. You know, I've seen people, you know, a black defendant, you know, maximum sentence. A white defendant, let's put them on probation. I think we're changing because we're seeing more and more appreciation of the sentencing process, not just including jail as a sentence. We have to go back to thinking that. We have to eliminate the tabloid thinking that there's no punishment unless it's jail. That's a very important notion for the community to grasp, as well as for those of us in the court system. So we can make policies that will hurt the minority community, as well as policies that will help everyone, but I think those tools have to be made available to judges. We see that a lot in the so-called treatment courts, but I've also seen people who say the treatment courts are filled with African-American children who smoke marijuana. Is that what we really need? Or is it that they need something, and the only, you know, I've heard black mothers say to me, why is it the only time I can get help for my child is if he's arrested? What about giving some help to this child before he's arrested, and why does the dollars come only for the not just for the public safety, but I think but for other needs in school, et cetera. But I think judges need more tools as well.
Hugely important statements. Thank you so much. We're going to turn now to the chair of the Permanent Commission on Sentencing, Cyrus Vance, who's also the district attorney here in Manhattan. Tell me what your thoughts are, Mr. Vance, on reflecting on the National Academy of Sciences report and its implications for New York, and more generally what you think New York has done well and where there's still areas for substantial reform.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. And Jeremy, thank you for convening this group, and to all of you who worked on the science report. New York has lots of issues to deal with and many areas to improve in. And I'm happy to talk about some of those specifically. But I think it's just important to step back and understand something that at least I haven't heard today, that there is a lot we're doing right in New York, and we need to understand what we're doing right, and I think try to then do more of that. So, for example, among the handouts given to you is something that I think might surprise some of you. It's not just, as was described, that our numbers of prisoners has gone down 25%, state prisoners, in the last 15 years. It is also that New York has the lowest imprisonment rate of any major state per 100,000 people. Big difference between 276 in New York, and you may think that's too high, and 606 in Texas. So there is something very interesting that's been happening in New York in the last 15 years. People more expert than I have talked about what are some of the factors, but I think among the factors are changes in the availability of alternatives to incarceration, not just in the drug area. And an understanding, an increasing awareness and understanding that the answer to every felony conviction is not necessarily more jail, and that prosecutors, and I believe police officers, are increasingly more sophisticated and more aware that when we try to achieve public safety, we achieve public safety in a number of ways today that we never thought it was our business to work in previously. It's no longer, at least in my office, and I believe I speak for many others, we don't measure our success, I don't measure our success just by how many conviction rates or convictions we received. I'm interested in knowing what we're doing to reduce crime in our communities on a long-term basis, not measured by one case, but measured by all that we do. So in our office, for example, and I think this is reflective of the Sentencing Commission's philosophy, I'm very interested in how we are handling reentry, and devote a lot of effort in our office now to meet with ex-offenders as they come out of the system to talk about choices and opportunities as they re-enter their communities, to talk about prevention. What are we doing aggressively to keep kids out of trouble? Because a kid kept out of trouble is a far better outcome than prosecuting a kid who got in trouble for everybody. So from our Sentencing Commission lens, we are trying to, I think we want to recognize what we're doing right. The determinate sentencing decision was we believed important to do. You couldn't have or shouldn't have a system that is half indeterminate and half determinate. It was not straightforward, it was confusing, and I don't think it was actually fair. But we've also taken on issues that we think are important, like raising the age of criminal responsibility to 18 years old, which Judge Bing Newton and I have been working on now for quite a bit of time. Our commission proposed to the legislature 2 or 3 years ago, and no one really picked up on it, that we should be raising the age of criminal responsibility, in our opinion, for young offenders, starting with nonviolent offenses, and then seeing how that works, determining whether or not it can be expanded. What I would just say before passing it on is I feel that we spend a lot of time talking about state prison and the issues which are hugely important, and you've talked about them. But I believe we do not spend enough time in this state or this country or this city supporting the work of judges in misdemeanor courts. This is the entry level for individuals who get stuck with a justice system where they get in trouble 2 or 3 times in misdemeanor court. We don't do enough to meaningfully address the problem and how to prevent them from recidivating. But by the time they've got 4 or 6 arrests, 3 or 4 misdemeanor convictions, then they come in and it's a felony, and they look at the file, we look at the file collectively as a society and say, well, this kid's irredeemable. Look, he's had 4 convictions. And I think part of it is we didn't spend enough time with that young man or woman the first time they went in to make sure that if there is an arrest and a crime has been committed, it may be that crime should be dismissed, but there should be some outcome that gives us confidence that we are actually doing something that will minimize the chance that this young man or woman is going to come back into the system again. And if we don't do that in the system of courts where we have the great majority of our cases, 90% of the work in our office by volume is done in our misdemeanor courts. And I think that's probably true for most DAs around the state. We don't pay attention to that court system. And until we do pay attention, we are going to continue to graduate young men and women from misdemeanor court to more serious felonies. And by the time they are felons, they are so far behind the 8 ball that we are going to be looking at prison sentences and more serious punishment.
So that's really helpful to focus on misdemeanor courts. I want to just take a step back and ask and press you a little bit, Mr. Vance, on the, since you pointed us to the fact sheet. If folks look on the back of the fact sheet, we've had a drop recently in overall prison population here in New York, down from a peak in 1998. But we're still looking at an increase over the past 30 years from 1980 to 2011 of about 20,000 to 55,000, more than doubling of the prison population. And that's staggering. Is that where the population should be, or do we still need to do substantial reform to address that very dramatic increase over the past 30 years?
Well, I think the goal of all of us should be to reduce the state prison population without sacrificing public safety. I think it's a continuous mission. I think we should go lower, but we shouldn't, and we should go lower intelligently. And that is alternatives and programs and options for offenders that will increase the chance that they shouldn't go to jail in the first place, because we have confidence that the programs that are available will achieve the results. So I think we can go lower. I can't tell you what that number is, but I do think that a 25% reduction of a state prison population in 15 years is a significantly good thing that has happened, and we should try to understand how we got there and do more of it.
So what do you understand as the takeaway message from this report for New York police, prosecutors, judges?
I think it is, to me, and I confess I haven't read the whole book, Jeremy, but I did read.
Skimmed it.
I did read at least some of it. I think it's a reminder of the responsibilities that we all have in the system to be thoughtful and to be guided not just by, as a prosecutor, being tough, but being smart and responsible, and to be concerned about fairness. I think that in all that this report seems to conveys, at least to me, is that they're guiding principles that we should all at least understand why we're doing what we're doing, and to make sure that whatever decision we make, it should be guided toward not only making us safer, but making our justice system fairer. That's my belief of the work that we're supposed to do. I believe fundamentally that's what I take away from this report, and why I think the report will continue to be a very important document for us.
Judge Bing-Newton?
One of the things I think that we might want to take a look at is that we saw some decreases in jail time and the number of people in prison, especially vis-a-vis the Rockefeller drug laws. And I admit to being not an academic, but an experiential learner kind of judge. But I asked Shawn the question, who's good at this stuff, what's the relationship between the length of time in jail and recidivism? So those are two things we're talking about, punishment, hopefully rehabilitation, but public safety in terms of recidivism. And I'd like to see someone do a study that explains and justifies the increase of the numbers in the box. And that maybe, from a legislative point of view, we should never have an increase in the number in the box, or an increase that will relate to a status change that will increase the number of boxes, sort of second felony offender and that kind of thing, until someone can say, and making this leap from 1 to 10 has the meaning that will give us something beyond retribution, because that's also, once again, a big factor in how we have more people in jail because of the length of jail sentences have increased dramatically over the last 40 years. And then I have to say, as an aside, a public acknowledgement, Mr. Vance and I had conversations about the criminal courts right after he was elected. I was the administrator of the court at the time, and to your credit, you've gotten them to give more money, more services to the court, and the numbers look much, much, much better. And you've followed through on your promise to make that misdemeanor court and a very important court, because that's how people do. They bounce from misdemeanor court to the next level. Most interesting with young people, it destroys their relationship with school, because they get arrested and they're thrown out of school, they don't go to school, et cetera. So every little step along this criminal justice continuum has an effect for the next step.
It very much does. Last question to you, Mr. Vance, and then we'll turn to the others on the panel. And that is, I understand that the commission, the permanent commission that you chair, is going to make recommendations to Chief Judge Lippman on some significant issues around sentencing. Can you outline those recommendations for us?
Sure, and I think Shawn alluded to it. We've been working on the very difficult issue of how do you translate indeterminate sentences to a determinate sentence. So in the indeterminate sentence system, a person who commits, in nonviolent cases, steals more than $1 million, could be subject to an indeterminate sentence of anywhere really between 1 to 3 years to 8 1/3 to 25 years. How do you take that number and translate it into a determinate sentence where the judge gives one number and that's the sentence? So the trick in going from indeterminate to determinate is, what is the range you're putting in the boxes? And that's what the research has helped us look at. What are the sentences that have been served in the state of New York, and how can we find the right range in each of the levels of crime that we are now making indeterminate? I will say also, Professor, that New York State has among the broadest ranges for judges to sentence in of any state that I practiced in. So there may be understandable frustration about judges feeling boxed in, but I would say that judges are far less boxed in New York than they are in the vast majority of states around the country. And it's, again, something that doesn't mean we're doing it perfectly, but I think we are closer to right than sometimes we understand.
And why will the move from indeterminate sentencing to determinate sentencing, why is that a just move? Why is it a recommendation?
I think it's a just move because certainty of time served, I think, is important for victims to understand clearly, because we haven't spent any time yet talking about victims. But they are obviously, and should be, item number one in talking about a criminal case. So victims will understand, as well as the accused and his or her family. I think the ranges that we have selected, based upon data, to transform an indeterminate to a determinate sentence will likely reduce by some measure the number of people that actually go into state prison. So for the B felony, for example, the top end of our determinate sentence is 12 years instead of 25 years.
So it could potentially reduce by narrowing the range to a lower range.
Yes, and I think without sacrificing public safety.
All right.
Because by looking at the time served data, we've put the upper end of the range really not far from the maximum sentences that have been imposed historically.
So I appreciate that. Thank you. I'd like to turn to Assemblymember Jeff Aubry and talk about really the larger frame of race, which has come up repeatedly this morning, but I wanted to give you an opportunity as someone who has so much experience in the legislature and in the community to talk a little bit about the ways that race motivates an analysis of these issues.
Certainly, and thank you very much for that opportunity, and certainly my appreciation to the committee and the work that they've done. When we began to look at these issues, I was interested in that handout. If you folks would take a look at it, there's some interesting delineations, I believe, in terms of if you just do drug arrests, right? So arrests in 2008, you had 42% of the arrests in the state were black, 15% were white, 42% were Hispanic. And you know, in the work that we did in Rockefeller, what we understood was that when surveyed around the country and around the state, that drug use was essentially proportionate to all race, a certain percentage, 30% of everybody did some sort of a drug. And we could probably take this crowd, have them stand up and raise their hands and prove that out. And yet, and then those who want to use drugs as soon as we legalize marijuana. But but what you see is this disparate arrest, indictment, and commitment relative to communities of color. And I use that as that sort of litmus test that, as I believe has always been said, that race matters. Race matters across the board in economics and education, in medical treatment, across the board. It was so interesting earlier to hear the discussion of, in the earlier group, talking about what goes on relative to prisons, who's in prison, who's receiving health care, what kind of health care they receive, and the proportion of minorities who are incarcerated. To me, the difficulty and the lack of services that get centered in prison has a lot to do with who goes there and where they come from and where they come back from. They get poor health care in their neighborhoods, they get poor health care when they're in the prison system, and they get poor health care and mental health care when they come out. And so it is this pervasive issue that America has not solved. We haven't solved it in New York State. We haven't solved it in this country. And it continues to provide us with these distinctly poor outcomes for African Americans and other minorities, and ultimately poor outcomes for the country. It was said earlier that there's going to be a period of time when the state and the country will be majority minority. Let me only remind you, in some states in this country, that isn't a new experience. And yet the minority majority learned how to deal with that. And in their way of dealing with that, it was similar to incarceration. So there are many people who believe that we are rolling back time by using old sets of principles. It is very dangerous for us to allow that to be the vision of criminal justice system, because you will not have a respect for law and order. People will not believe that they can get justice. People will go into courts forced to plea bargain because they don't want to be held in Rikers for X amount of time, take a lower plea, do a little bit of time, and then have found themselves committed to a life that they can't break out of. And these are our realities. It is, I think, important that as we educate, it was identified earlier that we need to educate legislators. The reality is we need to educate the population, because the population is only reflected by legislators. We may think that they do what they want to do. The truth is they satisfy that group that elects them, whoever that is, and wherever they come from. In this state, which is a very big state, you have a diverse kind of reality. And so if the population wants revenge and vengeance because they think that the color of those who are going to be sought and put into this are not them, then they will support legislators who push those kind of issues.
So you were instrumental in the state legislature in the reforms on Rockefeller drug laws. And Mr. Vance talked about having sent forward a proposal that raised the age of majority at which someone could be convicted of a crime to 18, or raise the age of, what's the technical term, Cy?
Raise the age of criminal responsibility,
Criminal responsibility,
which has been around.
Yeah, raise the age at which they could be held criminally responsible as an adult to 18, and talked about how the legislature didn't move on that. Tell us what you've learned and what you know about the prospects of criminal justice reform in the state legislature, given these two experiences of success and failure.
Several years ago, longer even before the district attorney was elected, Barbara Clark, assemblywoman in the assembly, raised this issue. This issue has been around for some time, and we are one of two states that managed to turn a blind eye to managing and caring for our young people. Because we have a divided political structure in this state, the Senate being Republican, the Assembly being Democratic, and conservatives on both sides, you don't get issues that move, that should move, that you have no particular reason to study anymore. I believe the governor decided he wanted to study this issue. Similarly, the governor had proposed to restore college programs to the prison system, which everyone says is a great idea. We know that when individuals who are incarcerated are able to get at least an associate's degree, their chances of recidivism drop dramatically. Isn't that what we all want? That reduces the prison population. So why wouldn't you do that? He put it out in a church, and you would have think he had declared the Third World War on upstate New York. So these are the political realities that are faced by legislators, and I don't believe, as was said before, that they need to learn anything. They need to learn that to get elected, they can have principles. And that seems to be the lesson that's missing in this case.
Let's turn to one of your colleagues in the Assembly and see if he agrees. Danny O'Donnell, tell us what...
Be careful what you wish for, Dean. Okay. Jeff was very politically astute in what he said. So let me just be less astute. And to correct Mr. Vance, our House did take up this issue and has taken up this issue on a regular basis. The state Senate has not. On criminal justice issues, the state Senate is a wholly owned subsidiary of the DA's Association. And if you think it's our fault, I'm here to tell you it is not our fault. It is the state Senate's fault. And if the DAs took the position to make it happen, it would be so. So that's the first thing. The second thing I just want to say about this other conversation, I don't believe that determinate sentencing is going to do a damn thing. I think it's just window dressing. I don't think it helps anybody in any way, shape, or form. And the third thing I want to say, if every judge was like the one to my right, I would give them discretion to do whatever they want. Unfortunately, when I practiced in Brooklyn during the crack years, there were a whole slew of judges. If you went to trial, you knew they were getting the max. That's just the way it was. And I once snidely, shockingly, said to one of them, why would the New York Post report on you sentencing someone to the max? It's only news if you don't, because he never did. So I don't think changing indeterminate determinate is going to help anybody.
Tell us, from your perspective, you're also, I think you're the chair of the Committee on Correction in the Assembly.
I am, yes.
And you talked recently about visiting your 17th
18th,
prison.
I counted again. I've been to 18.
18 it is. And one of the issues brought up in the National Academy of Sciences report is the conditions of incarceration and the dehumanizing aspects of incarceration and the lack of services. Has that, how would you reflect on that here in New York, given your experience?
Prior to me becoming chair of the Corrections Committee, the only state prison I had been in was Sing Sing as an attorney visiting a client. They vary in terms of what they are. The one thing that was very surprising to me was the people who run them take great pride in what they do. They view themselves as professionals who are working and living in a particular kind of system. There are places that are dangerous and depressing. I went to Clinton last week. Schwagunk, Green are all places that you could feel the danger in them. At Clinton last week, the inmates, I meet with the inmates alone, which the corrections folks don't care for. And I do that because the superintendents were writing down everything I said and calling the governor's office and telling them what I said. So my way to respond to them was to throw them out of the room. They're no longer allowed in the room when I talk to the inmates privately. And the detail with which they were able to explain how they were beaten while they were shackled was pretty outrageous to me. I'm going to Attica next week. Attica on 9/11. My husband said, what was choice B? But I'm going to Attica on 9/11. And Albion, which is the third women's facility. I've been to the other two, which is also near Attica. They're understaffed on the non-officer end. And so what you find prison by prison, the ones that are closer to New York City generally are better, particularly with staffing and because there are people here who want to help. People around Attica apparently don't really want to help the people who are in the prison. And so there are more access to more things locally. The ones that are further away, like for example at Albion, I read every letter that I get from inmates. I get about 100 a week. And Albion, a women's facility for example, they don't fill the vacancies for the people who provide the programming. And some of the programming that is being provided is a requirement for them to get merit time or for them to get work release or for them even to get paroled. So you have people who are playing by the rules, trying to get out, trying to do everything they can, and yet the system itself is not filling the slots to get the people to give them the programming that they say you have to have. So that's one of the problems, and I'm trying to address that to see where that is exactly. But it's particularly bad, for example, now at Albion. I just put them all in one file. They'll put them in the Albion file, and it's all the same complaint, that they're not allowed, they just can't get the programming that they're required to have.
So tell us if you could make, what's interesting is the way that the first panel pointed a lot to the legislature and said, there's a failure of leadership. And the legislators here are saying, well, it's not us, there's a failure of understanding in the public and a failure of the popular narrative to be persuasive around issues of criminal justice reform. Am I accurately describing that, Danny and Jeff, or would you take issue with that?
Well, I would agree with that. I would say when a white state senator's son gets arrested and caught in the web, maybe we'll get a change of attitude. And, everyone has to be you have to have the right spokesperson. Rosa Parks was not the first black woman to sit down on a bus, but she was the right one to lead that movement. And so when, in fact, it begins to affect people, like, for example, sealing of criminal records. Dale Volcker, who was the Prince of Darkness, and it comes to these things, right, became a real proponent for sealing. And all I could think of was that somebody in his family was arrested, and it came up 20 years later when nothing happened to it, and he was mad because I couldn't figure out any other reason why that man with his philosophy about criminal justice would latch on to that issue. So partly, yes, you have to have people who can latch on to the issue, who can be heard in a certain kind of way. You know, it's interesting. When I went to the Democratic Convention when Obama was nominated the first time, and I came back and gave a report on what that was like, and I was singing the praises of Bill Clinton and what a brilliant speech he gave. And an older white man, by which older than me, that means older, okay, raised his hand and said, I thought Barack Obama gave a pretty damn good speech. Why are you talking about Bill Clinton? And I said, because our demographic can't hear it from Barack Obama because he's black. So white men over 50 were not having a hard time accepting a black man in that role, whereas they could hear it from Bill Clinton. And that's why I thought it was important to say that. So in the end, there's a lot of things that can be done. There are a lot of what I'll call ancillary problems. I mentioned this the other day. We over-categorize crimes as violent. And when you so does it really matter in this court system? Let's just presume you have good judges and it doesn't. But once that designation is there, it follows that person forever. There are a whole bunch of things that they are not eligible for in the correction system because the crime was called violent. If the crime took place 20 blocks from here and I was sitting here when the crime took place and it's designated a violent felony, forever that's followed around. And that is something that we need to look more at an individual's actual behavior and not rely on just a designation.
Okay, that's helpful. Real quick, then
Yeah.
we've got to move on to two more, Jeff.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Let me say this, relative to whose fault it is. I think there's enough fault to go around for everyone, everybody who sits here, everybody who studies, everybody who practices in this field. I think it's pretty clear that we have left these issues alone. We've not wanted to be engaged. And so in doing that, everything that we have, we all own. And it won't be solved until we decide to own this issue. Prisons are built, as they say, to keep people in. What it does is keep everybody else out. Some brave people go there every day, sometimes not paid, and they are our eyes and ears, but we don't listen to them. And we don't seem to care about what goes on inside of those institutions. Everybody is all up in arms about Rikers, right here under our nose, liberal New York City. They're beating and smashing people and brutalizing them and creating gladiator games. It's all our fault. It's all our fault. And so until we accept that responsibility as a society, it will not change.
Point taken. Let's turn now to Mr. Glenn Martin. You're the founder and executive director of JustLeadershipUSA, which has the goal of cutting the U.S. prison population in half by 2030. Tell me how you developed that goal and how we're going to get there.
Thank you. So how did I develop that goal? Probably why I developed that goal is even more important. I've been doing this work for 13 years since exiting prison in New York State. And what motivates me to do this work hugely is what I saw while I was in prison, not just my own personal experience, but the many, many, many men, very intelligent, handsome, brilliant, some of America's best and brightest, stuck in our prison system for extremely long sentences, in many cases for crimes that were much less serious than the one I was there for. And through the 13 years of doing this work, it culminated for me in the idea that we needed to be as bold and audacious as possible if we're going to solve this problem, especially at a time when there's huge opportunity to do so, and where our Attorney General can stand up and say we have far too many people in prison for far too long for no good law enforcement reason, and we not hear the sort of backlash that we would have heard just a decade ago. And to me, that's indicative of the potential that exists right now for reform. So when I walked into the room, and thank you, Jeremy, for always inviting the voice of people directly impacted into the room. I think that, as you know, is hugely valuable. You've been consistent with that. And when I walked into the room this morning, I heard the conversation about values and about principles, and I was pleased to walk into a room that was having that sort of discussion, because if you look historically, it is a moral argument that leads America towards a tipping point when you have such an insidious system. And so, yes, we can look at the data, and I've been privileged to sit in on some of the Sentencing Commission meetings, thanks to Marty Horn. And those discussions are important. I think that this is a system that has been built devoid of looking at the research and the data, and has mostly been driven by things like fear and racism and classism and poverty and those sorts of things. So I think looking at the data is important. I think it'll get us to a certain goal. I think if you look at the 25% reduction, that is part of looking at the data. I think that's been part of the discussion. But I think we have to increasingly expand the conversation to talk about values. People often say to me, what sort of criminal justice system will we have in 2030 if we don't have the one we currently have? I don't think I have to answer that question. I think the question I have to answer is, what sort of values do we have as New Yorkers and as Americans? And then we should build a criminal justice system that reflects that. In one of the wealthiest cities in the United States, if not the world, we have an island just off LaGuardia Airport where people cook to death in cells. And by all measures, our response has not matched the scope of that sort of problem that exists in our backyard. And as Assemblyman Aubry just said, it exists because we own it, because we believe in it. Our criminal justice system continues to operate and exist because we all own it and believe in it. And whether you're doing this work every day or not, it doesn't matter, because if you're not speaking out against the system, in some ways you're complicit to what's currently happening. And I'm often appalled and taken aback at the response from some of our elected officials when something like what happens on Rikers Island happens. I can't believe that the response is not sharper, not more intense, and not sustained. You have a follow-up question? You shouldn't have gave me your mic, first of all. Last time I had this much access to the district attorney and judges, I had handcuffs on. I'm not giving you this mic back just yet. Let me go a little bit longer here. So two things. So earlier someone mentioned that we need an inside-outside strategy. And I agree. And I've learned how to do this work using an inside-outside strategy. And however, I'll say this. The inside strategy, unfortunately, often comes to those who have access and privilege. And most of the people I know and care about, the people I've been talking to on Facebook all this week about this event, and I'm glad many of them made it into this room, the people I pass every day in Harlem, don't have that level of access and privilege. And we, as people who do, have to constantly make space for that and recognize that and identify our own privilege and open up opportunities for folks' voices to be heard. And then for the outside piece, Rockefeller drug law reform was one of the biggest stains in my career, in my opinion. I think we made a bunch of huge mistakes with Rockefeller reform. One being not paying attention to what implementation would look like. And as an advocate, that was a huge lesson learned for me. I guess after 36 years, we couldn't see victory. And unfortunately, when we did, I think we didn't pay enough attention to implementation. And the implementation that happened has not matched the vision, I think, of the advocates or members of the legislature who helped drive this forward. And then secondly, I think what happened right after the Rockefeller drug law reform is that the capacity of advocates in New York State to push elected officials and other decision makers to do the work was hugely diminished. And I think it's because Rockefeller drug law reform gave us a fire in our belly about something, and I don't think that has been replaced yet. And so I'm speaking to the advocates that are in the audience, and I know there are many out there, that we need to really think about how to push our elected officials to do the right thing, because this conversation is all centered around one word, risk. And I can't think of anyone that has the least amount of appetite for risk than people who have to get elected, and that's fine. But then I think that how we bolster them in doing the work, because many of them do want to do the right thing, is that we have to be the wind underneath their wings. So we have to turn around and rebuild our own capacity to do so.
Well, you answered all my questions there. No, I did have one question, something that hasn't come up here. You mentioned in part the need to include formerly incarcerated individuals in the dialogue for criminal justice reform. And I wanted to talk, to give you an opportunity to reflect a little bit more on why and tell us that. And then also ask you about the experience of families, kind of the larger community directly around those who are incarcerated, what their experience is like, and why it's important to bring them to the table on these issues.
Sure. So first of all, I think it's a resource issue. I think no matter how many millions or billions of dollars we pour into our criminal justice system, the resources will never match the scope of the problem. And the biggest resource we have that remains partially untapped is the families of people directly impacted and the communities where they come from. So that's why I think it's important for us to recognize, as people who are making these decisions, that if we want a criminal justice system that does reflect our values, you can't build that with just people who do it because they come to work. You know, I mean, I went to college because a correctional counselor came to work that day and said, wow, your grades are amazing, you should go to college, and sent me to a prison that happened to still have a college program. Great. That's not going to happen for everyone. Unfortunately, while many people call me the exception, the truth is I was exposed to exceptional opportunities. And I think that if we bring the families and the communities into the conversation, those things multiply exponentially. Another reason to have people directly impacted in the room, and I'll just give an example, and sorry if you don't mind, I'll touch on something you said earlier, where you said we haven't talked enough about the victims. Well, you know what? I didn't learn how to pull out a weapon on someone until someone pulled out a weapon on me. And many of the people who are in our criminal justice system have been victims of crimes. And so as we talk about the people in our system, we actually are talking about victims in many ways. And so having people directly impacted in the room just reminds us of those things, right? I remember when I started at the Legal Action Center, where I landed serendipitously after coming out of prison to answer the phones at the front desk, and then sort of grew there and was nurtured there by many of the attorneys there. I remember going into rooms with people like Chauncey Parker, who works for you, and other decision makers, and then walking out and having them say, wow, you are just so smart. And I was thinking, like, well, not really. I wonder why they're saying that. I couldn't grasp it. And what it was that I was giving them a different lens to think about things, and the lens was experience. And it came across as intelligence, fine, but it was really me applying my own laugh tests to some of the recommendations I was hearing in the room, and for other people, they found it to be hugely valuable. So I think we need to continue to do it, and I think we need to do it in a meaningful way, and I think there's a responsibility amongst people who have served time to build their capacity to be able to be in those rooms in a meaningful way, which is a big part of the work of Just Leadership USA.
We all hope that you're successful on that. I'd like to talk a little bit, and I wish that I could spend more time talking with each one of you. I know that all of us do. But I want to turn to you, Professor Rossana Rosado, and ask you, pardon me? And ask you to
It's my
help.
second day here, so I'm not used to professor.
Oh, okay. Second day old professor. That's great. It is a title that takes some getting used to, so welcome to it. You were formerly the publisher for 14 years of El Diario La Prensa, and you're particularly interested in something that really undergirds the dialogue that we've had so far, and that is the public discourse on criminal justice reform, the traditional concepts around it, and how to change it. And if you could talk a little bit about that, I'd appreciate it.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I feel like I'm not really at the level of this panel, but you know, Jeremy wanted me here, so I'm here. It's my second day at John Jay, and I'm thrilled to be, you know, part of this conversation. And I want to support, you know, all the things that Glenn says, which are really important for all of you in this room to continue to include, you know, the stakeholders, the real stakeholders, the people affected. But you know, the undercurrent of all that we're talking about today is this public discourse, how we feed that discourse. And, you know, with respect to the legislators, I feel like it's not my fault, because in the 14 years that I was at El Diario, I led coverage on this issue. We had twice a year briefings from Joanne and her staff. We let, of course, the paper, it was in Spanish, so maybe some of you missed it. But I think it's important to take, the reports, the findings, the attention of the people in this room, from both the law enforcement and especially from the advocates, that we maximize this opportunity. I see Juan Cartagena, who's been leading the charge on issues of justice, social justice, and is now heading an important organization in the Latino community, that we have to kind of turn the tide on the conversation. So 2 things that I think are important, to turn all those buzzwords into a public discourse. If the public doesn't feel safe, it's because we don't make them feel safe, because we are not having the discourse that will make them feel safe. So we talk about reentry, or we talk about sentencing, and we always come back to making public safety a priority. But there are so many things going on in this system right now that are not about public safety. And those of you who are advocates and those of you who are in the prisons every day know what those issues are. With respect to my neighbor here who says, New York is much better than other states. Well, that's a very low bar, because the other states are doing badly. You can applaud, because I like that. So I think that, first of all, the bar may be set low. We should do better. And because we are New York, we should be leading the charge. We should be leading the country in what is the right thing to do. What is the humane thing to do? What is the right way in which we say that we're giving people a second chance? How we treat them when they get out, how we treat them when they're getting out. And I would like to add to the discussion today how we treat the families. Families of people who are incarcerated didn't do anything wrong, and in trying to do things right are not treated well. They're not treated well by us. They're not treated well by the folks who work at the prisons, and they're not even considered when we talk about bringing people back home. And finally, I just want to say that among the things that are not working is the parole board in this state. The parole board doesn't have the attention of the legislature, doesn't have the attention of the public, and doesn't really know what their role is. Many people in this room may not even know the names of the 19 people who are on the parole board. I don't think they know what their role is. And so we're talking about reform in the country, and we're talking about setting an example and leading, and yet we have a group of people who are not really sure what their role is, and they think their role is to keep people in, when we have all the evidence and all the data and all the, I want to say, intelligence, using that term lightly, to show that there are ways in which to let many more people out of prison, and the public safety will not be at risk. And so I say all of that to say that it's time to take this discussion outside of these circles and to the public. And yes, that includes, I'll take a little bit of the blame for the media, my challenged colleagues in the English language media, but it's also our responsibility to take the message to media, and it's our responsibility to use social media, to use, to upload that content, to take this knowledge that we have and to turn this report and the statistics into public discourse. I think it's high time we do that, and we have everyone in this room, so no one should leave until we have a plan to do that. Thank you.
I wanted one more question for the professor, and then we'll open it up for questions from all of you. I wanted to, you're also chair of the Governor's Council on Reentry and Reintegration, and I wanted to talk about the connection between reentry and reintegration and safety in the community, because that's so much a part of the public discourse that needs to change. Thoughts about what constitutes public safety, how to do it well, and how to think about it. Could you talk a little bit about that work and how it affects your analysis of this?
Not really, because our first meeting is next week.
All right.
But in the room is Marta Nelson. Where is Marta? Who is our executive director for that council, and there are many members in the audience. And what I want to say about public safety is, again, that we have to have a new conversation about exactly what people think is public safety, or what makes them feel safe. What the media says to make them feel safe is not necessarily true. And so we have many members on the council who are really experts on that, I'm only expert in getting the messages out. But I think that's a big deal, and I think, you know, Vance mentioned it and talks about it, and law enforcement, we have many champions. I believe more champions now than in the last 10 years. We have many champions of this cause, which is public safety, but also reentry, a real chance at coming back. We have more champions than ever in law enforcement, and we need to work with them. We need to empower them to do the right thing and to kind of minimize that risk. So I think we're going to see a conversation about public safety, and I also think it's important not just for law enforcement, but also for the legislators, because they have to go back and, you know, and get elected, as Glenn said. So I think that's a big item on the agenda. You want to say something?
And not to be defensive, but the legislature has looked at parole, has passed legislation to reform parole, but the implementation, which is the executive's responsibility, has not gone on. And you must remember, parole board members are confirmed by the Senate. So they know what they're doing. Never believe that ignorance is that excuse. They know exactly what they're doing. They know how they meet. They know the decisions that they make. They know the number of times they hit people. So this isn't a beneficent group that just gets lost. They go with an intent to do the job that they do. So you should remember that. And every executive agency that has a responsibility on the Department of Corrections and how we provide services, they are not doing what I believe they should do. The regents don't look at education. The health department doesn't look at health care necessarily. The mental health commissioner doesn't necessarily ensure that you get the same standard of care in the prisons that is received on the streets, even if that may not be so great. But we have the connections, we just don't make the connections happen.
Do you have anything final to say? Okay, so we will open it up now for questions from the audience. I see that we have one coming to the microphone here. Yes, ma'am.
Hi there, my name is Patricia Ward from...
Patricia, you want to speak a little bit more into the mic? Nope. You could use one of ours. Yeah, why don't you just come on up? We'll get this moving.
Here you go.
My name is Patricia Worf from the Center for the Community Alternatives, and there was some discussion on the panel about the need to shift to determinate sentencing to promote the value of certainty for victims. I confess to having been the victim of a crime that frankly rocked my world. And as you said that, I wondered what would matter to me in terms of my attacker being released. Would I prefer that he be released at a date certain, or would I prefer that he be released when ready to live a law-abiding life in the community? And so it occurred to me, I wonder about a sentencing scheme that's not driven by the principles of certainty and retribution, but is instead driven by the principle of sentences that are designed to promote successful reintegration into the community. And if that kind of, what that kind of sentencing scheme would mean for the panelists, but also in terms of what you said about, would that really be the type of sentencing scheme that could promote public safety in a sense of true public safety? Thank you.
Good question. Mr. Vance, you want to take that?
Sure, I'll start. I'm sure others have their thoughts. Thank you for the question, and I think it points out some of the real weaknesses that we have, whether it's determinate or indeterminate sentencing, is that when we send someone to prison, and I think I'm channeling Jeremy on this, we have a responsibility to do what we can so that when they leave prison, the outcome is as likely to be successful for them as the community they return to. And I think that should really start at the time of sentencing. And we should have more resources in our criminal justice system, putting aside for a moment how we're going to, should they be, college education and others, and how we're going to pay for them. We don't do a good enough job of taking people who go to prison and have them as a responsibility for our criminal justice system to help them when they get out, before they get out. And I think it's, there's lots that we can do to make the experience of the individuals that are incarcerated, we can, and I hope Glenn will agree with me, is that we just don't do enough because it isn't enough of a priority for us, but it's all about public safety. What we invest in prevention, we reap in success or a greater degree of success when individuals come out.
You know, as a judge, I'd like to be able to say when I sentence somebody, I want all of the above. You know, as a person who's been a victim, who've had very serious victimization in my family, so I don't know that certainty itself is enough, or a time certainty when you get out, because that keeps shifting. You know, we had determinate sentence, and then we decided determinate sentence, we wanted some post-release supervision. Looked a lot like parole to me. So that means we're still very conflicted about what we think should be the outcome when we engage in this sentencing that sends someone to jail. So we want all of those things that we learned in Criminal Law 101, incapacitation, rehabilitation, et cetera. And I think that for me as a judge, when I sentence someone to jail, I'd like to think that when they get out, all of the above will be done. But I think I agree with DA Vance that we have a shifting focus on how to do that. And the one thing that we thought made it easier, I think the community at large, is just keep them locked up. And we now know that that's not going to work because they all come home. For the most part. So I think it means that the issues that we have to look at in criminal justice sentencing are as easily stated as it was in Criminal Law 101. There's 4 reasons for sentencing, and as complicated and complex as anything that we would challenge to do every day. The hope is, though, that we don't make things worse, and I think that's one of the things this report suggested, that things have not been better, they've gotten worse. And so now is an opportunity to rethink and start over again, to say, what is it that we want to do, what is it we have to do, and how do we prioritize everything after?
Thank you. We're going to take a question over here.
Hello, hello? You hear me?
Yes.
I wanted to address the issue with...
Just hold it louder to your mouth.
Right here?
There you go.
I think I can be an entertainer. So I wanted to address the issue with youth, young adults, that is in the communities throughout the 5 boroughs. I understand that when young youth get arrested, and they're standing behind with their attorney, and the judge say, you're pleading guilty because in fact you are guilty. Did anyone force you to say that you're guilty? At that point, a young teenager is not really sure what's going to go on. And they're kind of coerced to say, in fact, I'm guilty. Let me just get my misdemeanor and go on about my business. But that does not address the issue of the trust on that matter with that social worker that met with that child, along with the attorney. How do you build the trust once a child has been kind of coerced to saying, in fact, they're guilty? Or should I just go get some services to try to address this issue before this stigma continue on?
It's a really important question about trust from the person who's being subjected to the forces of the criminal justice system, but also legitimacy.
Correct.
From the larger community, based on what that individual is told and understands or has the capacity to understand at the time.
Correct.
Thoughts about that?
Well, you know, this is why raising the age of criminal responsibility is such a passion for me, because I've had 39 years of looking at teenagers, 16, 17, 18, coming before the courts and being asked those very important questions. What will this mean for my criminal history? What will mean this for me to be able to get money to go to college? What will this mean with the numerous collateral consequences that are just completely, as the kids would say, off the chain? There's a Professor Zeidman, I believe, who says that there should be a policy in New York State that there should be no guilty pleas taken in arraignments, right? Because why would you do that, particularly when you have a young person, and Mr. Vance would agree with me, because we have 600,000 of these cases to deal with every day. And so sometimes the business of the courts gets in the way of the justice of the court. I would simply say that we depend on the attorneys who are assigned to these young people to provide representation for them that they would if it were their own child before the court. And if that means to slow it down, take some time to explain it, then they should simply do that. You know, some judges ask a lot of questions. I was one who did, and sometimes I wouldn't ask the questions because I was sure that the kid didn't know what I was talking about. And so I had to sort of try to speak their language, which sometimes we're successful and sometimes we're not. But programs, like I understand there's some pre-appearance programs that are being funded by sort of groups like the Center for Court Innovation that may be a good prototype for the future as to how to better handle cases with these young people.
Sure, I just wanted to touch on something the judge said about 600,000 cases. Unfortunately, that means 600,000 cases for many of those defense attorneys also. And I remember when I came into the system as a younger person and got a youthful offender adjudication, which in New York State means you're not saddled with the stigma of a criminal conviction, even though there's punishment that comes with it. And I remember while he did such an amazing job of getting me that YO, he didn't do such an amazing job of explaining to me what the opportunity was and the fact that I didn't have a conviction. So I went on with life as if I had a conviction and really did live that way. So I think it's on both ends. I think it's unfortunate because it means that we do have a system that's so large that we're siloing everything, everybody, everything. We put a label on it and we send it on its way. And when I think about young people, we live in a state where there's not much nuance around whether you can smoke or drink or rent a car or any of these other things. And much of it is based on what the science tells us about young folks. I know Vinny talks about this a lot. And yet, as soon as a person ends up with handcuffs on, all that stuff goes out the window.
I'm Liz Gaines from the Osborne Association. There's a lot of interesting questions, but one of the things that was in Jeremy's report related to, on the one hand, making prisons nicer or better, and the other was the harm to families. And you also mentioned people directly affected, so I wanted to make sure to bring families into the room. From my own experience of doing 7,000 miles a year and $50,000 in collect phone calls for my kids, that when you talk about the harm of incarceration and you put your prisons 400 miles away, for Albion, I feel like we're personally Osborne is keeping JetBlue in business, just bringing children to see their mothers at Albion. How any of you think we can resolve how you reduce the impact on families while programs in prison does not bring people closer to home, and it does not enable people to stay connected to their families. So I'm thinking in New York State, given where we put our prisons, what thoughts any of you have about how to resolve those two aspects of the report that are completely in conflict?
I'll be brief. I want to focus on New York City for a second, because I think that Rikers Island, I think we have an opportunity to literally shut down Rikers Island, decentralize the jail, and put people closer to home in their communities. And if there's ever an opportunity, I think right now with everything that's happening at Rikers, there's a chance to do that. But if we can't do that here in New York, where we realize that the data says that people being closer to their families and social services and so on is important, in New York State, where we've set up this system where our prisons really feed the economy upstate, I don't know how we get to that point, which is a valuable point.
You know, the problem is it's purely political, because the governor has closed the prisons that are close to here. Why we closed Arthur Kill is a mystery to me. Why we closed the two women's prisons a couple years ago, again, is a mystery. It's the wrong thing to do. And it reflects, the money we spend is reflected in the values that they have. It's about the bottom line. It's cheaper and easier for the government to not keep those smaller places open, and I think it's really wrong. We have a very limited ability on the legislative end to stop the executive from making those decisions, and for the people who represent those areas where those prisons are, they are often the only source of decent jobs in those communities. I was at Riverview, Ogdensburg, and Cape Vincent last week, and you know, so there's that dichotomy between what it means to the local economy, and then what it means for the larger perspective of where we choose to do that. And if we keep on closing the ones that are close to New York City, we're only exacerbating the problems for the families.
Yes, sir.
Yes, hello.
So
thank you.
it was
Jeffrey-
clearly a political,
Jeffrey, super quick, because we got another question. We only got 2 minutes. Go ahead.
political decision. Senate wanted the city of New York to suffer, so they closed Arthur Kill when they were closing upstate prisons. As simple as that. It's not a mystery.
Thank you for that. Yes, sir.
Yes. My name is Faib Mualim Ak. I'm the director of the Incarcerated Nation campaign. Also, I would like to thank Glenn Martin for, of course, bringing up the point that people previously incarcerated sometimes basically have all the answers, being through all the problems. I'd also like to congratulate, of course, Assemblyman Aubry for sponsoring the Halt Solitary Confinement Act, but also Danny O'Donnell for his brave and leadership within the Corrections Council and his bill also. My question is in somewhat negate to, I fail to see how New York is in leadership when city jails, when it takes our family members 7 hours to go visit someone for 45 minutes. That is the process of Rikers in most majority of city jails. I fail to see our leadership when we use solitary confinement well over the national average, sometimes 4 times over the national average in city jails, when we pay the most for incarceration in New York State. I do understand that we are leaders, and of course our governor is closing facilities that we don't want him to close. We want him to close Attica and the worst places, but it's hard to work with a governor who's actually closing down facilities when you ask him to. So my question really is also, how do we lead by example, by creating new reforms that are looking for different projects in other states as a model, but how do we create this model comprehensively is to support the families? I also work on the weekends. I do free bus trips up to facilities. I work with urban farmers upstate, and it's a complicated problem. There is no bus system for family members. Towns like Attica, you can't even get a hotel or a cab to get you from the facility, so there is no transport system. And our families are suffering, and this is what I work with on a professional basis, on a daily basis. So I see the frustration, but I fail to see where we are in leadership capability. We should be. We have the largest penal colony on the planet, but we're not. It's still just a sad place of brutality and a culture of violence to the point that we even take kids there to scare them about prison. And that is how shocking our city jails are, not too far from right here. So if you could please expound upon that leadership in which we are, quote unquote, in a leading position. Thank
I think
you.
that's a really important comment, and I appreciate your experience and your sharing it with us. Is there someone on the panel who would like to comment very briefly, given that we're very close to being out of time on that issue?
Well, I thank you for your compliment. You know, all I can say is we can only do what we can do. I don't like going to prisons. I find them very depressing, and yet I've been to 18 of them in the last year. When I meet with the superintendents, many of whom seem to be decent enough guys and women, some aren't, I see all the shoes, and I ask them how many people are in the shoes. And when I get to one where they have 42 units and they have 42 people in them, I remind them that Mr. Aubry has a bill that would limit shoe to 15 days, and they almost fall over. And then I tell them that they have a choice. It's a chicken and egg thing. Either you stop overusing shoe, or we're going to take away your right to have it.
Danny, tell everybody what SHU means.
It's solitary confinement, special housing unit. There's a lot of acronyms in docs. There are more acronyms I can't tell you, but SHU is special. It's basically solitary. And so, is that doing enough? Is that providing the leadership that we need to provide? I don't know, but it's what I can do because my assembly pass gets me into any prison in the state anytime I want to. And so, next week, 2 more. I'll make it to 20.
I really appreciate the work of everyone on this panel, and I'd like to give them a round of applause.